Good afternoon. Are you still listening? So I commend you for being so faithful, attending this conference. We had many presentations, but I hope that the fact that you're still here is indicating that you find this interesting. I've been sort of wondering a bit why Dr. Landless sort of scheduled me last. One explanation, I thought it could be that he was saving the best for last. Alternative sort of possibility was that he was doing some kind of sort of damage control. If this would be a total failure and a scandal, then at least you have already attended all the other presentations. Or there could be something else. I don't know. But I look forward to sharing this presentation with you. And when, I guess most of you who came here, you came by plane. When you boarded the plane before takeoff, they told you to put on your safety belt. And before you landed, they told you to have your safety belt on, and probably they told you to keep your safety belt on while you were seated in case of turbulence. I would suggest that you put on your safety belt now. Not because we are expecting any earthquake, or I don't think there will be much turbulence in the room, but what I'm going to share with you may challenge you. It may challenge your thinking, your perceptions, and I hope it may trigger some soul searching. Because when we're dealing with fanaticism, that's not just an issue of placing labels on others, but it's something we all have the potential for. I want to start with a story. It's a true story. It could have been an Adventist story. I don't think it is, but it could have been. It's Jack, 48 years old. Jack was a 48-year-old Christian who was affiliated with a conservative denomination. He was married with 3 children and had been struggling with severe depression for nearly 2 years. When Jack lost his job because of poor performance, because of this depression, he became even more depressed and began contemplating suicide. Despite encouragement from his wife and pastor to ask his physician for an antidepressant, Jack resisted doing so, saying, "I just need to have more faith in God's healing power." Jack also rejected suggestions from his wife to seek mental health counseling, saying those immoral, anti-God psychotherapists cannot be trusted. And unfortunately, on this point, his pastor agreed with him. 6 weeks later, after losing his job, Jack committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with a handgun. It's a tragic story. And it's a story about how, because of some ideas, some extreme views, and I would say some unfounded views, they cost this man his life. Fortunately, when we're dealing with fanaticism, death is not always the outcome, but a whole lot of problems may be caused by it. I want to share some quotes with you from Ellen White. And this is not just because that's what we do as Adventists when we gather together and talk. It's because what she is sharing has such a depth in the area when she's talking about fanaticism, and it's so relevant for our context and our situation. And she said this: as the end draws near, the enemy will work with all his power to bring in fanaticism among us. And we believe that we are nearing the end. He would rejoice to see Seventh-day Adventists going to such extremes that they would be branded by the world as a body of fanatics. Against this danger, I am bidden to warn ministers and lay members. Who bade her to warn the church about this? It's God. This is a message from God to the Seventh-day Advent Church. Be careful, beware of fanaticism. But at the same time, I want to share this because this is a caution also against, we're not here to go and label others about fanaticism. Be careful about that, because she says, when the Lord works through human instrumentalities, when men are moved with power from on high, from God, Satan leads his agents to cry fanaticism and to warn people not to go to extremes. Let all be careful how they raise this cry. She's not saying that we never should raise this cry, but she's saying be careful. Because if you are opposing the real truth, you're actually going the errand of the devil. Just some definitions, what we're talking about, so we got our terminology clear. Fanaticism and extremism are words that I think we can use quite synonymously. The Merriam-Webster, they define fanaticism as outlook or behavior especially exhibited by excessive enthusiasm, unreasoning zeal, or wild and extravagant notions on some subject. And you see in extremism, it says belief in and support for ideas that are very far from what most people consider correct and reasonable. Sometimes, it's not always, if you have views that differ significantly from the majority, it doesn't mean you're wrong. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you are an unhealthy extremist. But these are the definitions. What is not a synonym of extremism and fanaticism is fundamentalism. Fundamentalism refers often more to movements within Protestantism or other kinds of movements that have a very strict sort of in adherence of certain basic principles. They can be prone to fanaticism and extremism, but they are not synonyms. I want to share with you from a very interesting article published by Perkinson in 2002, titled Fanaticism, Flight from Fallibility. And if you're like me, that are not that steady always in English, fallibility is the tendency to make mistakes or be wrong. He proposes that fanaticism is our denial, our attempts to escape this reality, that being a human being is to be fallible. And I think what he shares is very interesting. He lists three main characteristics of what he would define as a fanatic. He says the fanatic is dogmatic. He insists that his theories, and it's the emphasis on insist, he insists that his theories, his ideology, his solutions are the correct ones, unquestionably. Second, a fanatic is an obscurantist. He ignores or cannot perceive arguments, facts, or consequences that refute his solutions, his beliefs, his ideas, unwilling or unable to see that. And finally, typically, a fanatic is authoritarian. When he has the power, he tries to impose his answers on others. And then he reflects on this. He says, dogmatism, obscurantism, and authoritarianism are all out of keeping with the human condition of fallibility. And when people become fanatics, when they try to become like God, they frequently make life hell for other people. And I think if we have encountered extremism, fanaticism, this may resonate with us. They make life hell for other people. Some of the problems of fanaticism, the fundamental objection to fanaticism is that it prevents improvement. Instead of improving what they possess and profess, fanatics, they dogmatically celebrate it, they obscure its inadequacies, and they strive to impose it on others. And it says when they succeed, they may achieve a widespread unity within the fanatical group, the fanatical movement, but improvement leaves little room for that. He reflects and he shares all that God has made is perfect, but all that man makes is imperfect, inadequate. Do you agree with this? Man's knowledge is never perfectly true. His behavior is not absolutely good. His societies are not the best possible. And he says, man is not omniscient nor omnipotent. What he creates is always improvable. But this is a hard reality to face because we strive for perfection and we don't want to acknowledge that we are just fallible human beings. Man can ignore his condition of fallibility and declare that his knowledge is true, that his actions are good. He can claim to be God or like God. At this point, he becomes a fanatic. I want to share one quote from Charles Darwin. That's not something we often do in an affirmative way within our tradition. But I think what he says here is very true. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. And this has been developed further to what is now become known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And Dunning himself, he describes this. I described the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which poor performers in many social and intellectual domains seem largely unaware of just how deficient their expertise is. Just reflect on that, how they are unaware of just how deficient their knowledge, their expertise is, and what are the consequences. It says there's a double burden often to this. Not only does their incomplete and misguided knowledge lead them to make mistakes as we would expect, but the exact same deficits also prevent them from recognizing when they actually are making mistakes, and other people are actually choosing more wisely. I've tried to summarize this in sort of a more, even easier and more accessible way. So the challenge we are sometimes facing is that when people are ignorant or are lacking knowledge on something, often what happens, unfortunately, they are too ignorant to know that they are ignorant. And that's one of the reasons why education is so important, and why education, research, science is one of the best buffers against fanaticism. Eric Hoffer, he published in 1951 a book that has become a classic on fanatical movements. It's an amazing book, lots of reflections. You may not agree with everything he says, and he doesn't expect you to either. It's a sharing of reflections, opinions. But what he calls like the true believer, or the self-proclaimed true believer, also what he would call a fanatic. And I would just like to share some of the dynamics that he had reflected upon. And this, remember, this is 1951, after the Second World War. Communism is strong in the East. Fascism has played out its role in Europe. And we've seen a lot of fanaticism, and the US is heading into it in its own ways. The fanatic cannot be weaned away from his cause by an appeal to his reason or moral sense. but he finds no difficulty in swinging suddenly and wildly from one holy or so-called holy cause to another. He cannot be convinced, but only converted. Though they seem to be opposite poles, fanatics have more in common than they might believe. Fanatics of all kinds are actually crowded together at one end. It is the fanatic and the moderate that are poles apart and never meet. Again, it says about the fanatic, he's even ready to join in a holy crusade against his former holy crusade or holy cause. But he said it must be what he calls a genuine crusade, characterized that it's uncompromising, intolerant, proclaiming the one and the only truth. And again, if you reflect on your encounters, or maybe your own personal experience with fanaticism, maybe this also resonates. He continues, it says mass movements, and then he talks about fanatical movements, but also in other types. But he says they can rise and spread without the belief in God. There are secular mass movement, fanatical movements that become very strong, that are not inherently religious or Christian. But he says, but they never rise without the belief in a devil. And then we're not just talking about the devil as Satan in the Bible, but this enemy image, the devil. Usually the strength of a mass movement is proportionate to the vividness and tangibility of its devil. And here I would like to raise a reflection or concern. Sometimes when we encounter within Christianity, maybe within our church, people, groups who seem to be more fascinated by the devil or the works of the devil, who talks more about it, focuses more about that than the works of God. That is a red flag. He says then more about the dynamics, the intrapsychic, the interpersonal dynamics that often happen. He says the act of self-denial seems to confer on us the right to be harsh and merciless toward others. The awareness of their individual blemishes, and I listen to this. Why are people so judgmental and so harsh? The awareness of their individual blemishes and shortcomings inclines the frustrated, the fanatics, to detect ill will and meanness in their fellow men. Self-contempt, however vague, sharpens our eyes for the imperfections in others, whether real or projected or perceived. We usually strive to reveal in others the blemishes we hide in ourselves. Whenever I encounter people who seem to be very harsh, very judgmental, very strict on one particular subject, I sometimes wonder, what is that person struggling with in their own life? What are they hiding? And to sum this up, I want to go back to Ellen White, because what she says is so good. And you will see some of the things I've shared now, you will hear this in what Ellen White shares. But remember, Ellen White, she wrote this before any of the other things that I've shared. So some quotes, I will read them, and I please wish that you will follow along with that. It is this desire and plan of Satan to bring in among us those who will go to great extremes. Listen, people of narrow minds, you are critical and sharp and very tenacious in holding their own conceptions of what the truth means, their own conceptions of what the truth means. They will be exacting and will seek to enforce rigorous duties and go to great lengths in matters of minor importance, while they neglect the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and the love of God. She continues, through the work of a few of this class of persons, the whole body of Sabbath keepers will be designated as bigoted, pharisaical, and fanatical. The work of the truth, because of these workers, will be thought of as unworthy of notice. The greatest dangers we sometimes are facing is not from the outside, but extremism, fanaticism on the inside can do more harm than anything else. She says, we have found in our experience that if Satan cannot keep souls bound in the eyes of indifference, we don't want people to be indifferent to truth. But the opposite, or the other extreme, is equally dangerous. The devil will try to push them into the fire of fanaticism. Neither of these places are places we ought to be found or where we want to find others. Some are ever disposed to go to extremes. They can never come up to the mark and then be content to stop. They go beyond. They fail to make use of the reason heaven has granted them. We have been given a brain, an ability to think, an ability to reason, because we are to be reasonable. Never forget that. And you've got a brain because you're supposed to use it. I have something to say in reference to extreme views of health reform. Here she's bringing it closer to our work in health and also within health ministry. I have something to say in the reference to extreme views in health reform. Health reform becomes health deform, a health destroyer when it is carried to extreme. This is serious. Health deform, health destroyer. When those who advocate hygienic reform carry the matters to extremes, people are not to be blamed if they become disgusted. Too often our religious faith is brought into disrepute, and in many cases those who witness such exhibitions of inconsistency can never afterward be brought to think that there is anything good in the reform. What a tragedy. These extremists do more harm in a few months than they can undo in a lifetime. They are engaged in a work which Satan loves to see go on. Two classes of people have been presented before me. Those who are not living up to the light. That's not good. But the other one, those who are too rigid in carrying out their one-sided ideas of reform and enforcing them on others. When they take a position, they stand to it stubbornly and carry nearly everything over the mark. Those who labor for Christ should be men. And here now she's presenting what we should be like. This is not the problem, this is the ideal that we should be striving for. Those who labor for Christ should be men and women of great discretion, so that those who do not understand their doctrines, do not understand them yet, have not grasped it, may not have caught interest yet, that at least they may be led to respect them and regard them as persons void of fanaticism, void of rashness and impetuosity. Their discourses and conduct and conversation should be of a nature that will lead men to the conclusion that these ministers are men of thought, of solidity, of character, men who fear and love their Heavenly Father. They should win the confidence of the people so that those who listen to the preaching may know that the ministers have not come with some cunningly devised fable, but that their words are words of truth, a testimony that demands thought and attention because it's reasonable. Let the people see you exalting Jesus and hiding self. Those who are close students of the word, following Christ in humility of soul. Fanaticism is the opposite of humility. Those who follow Christ in the humility of soul will not go to extremes. The Savior never went to extremes, never lost self-control, never violated the laws of good taste. My prayer is that this may be said of all of us, this may be said of health ministry, and that this may be said of the church. Amen.